It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's interesting. It's so interesting.
Okay. Welcome to It's So Interesting, where people talk about their work and life experience. I am George Spitzer. Today I'm talking with Sylvia Hill, who was an English teacher until she retired. Okay, let's get right to it. You're here because I heard that you were teaching English in Afghanistan.
And I'll never forget the first day that I went into the classroom, because this was my first day of teaching, so I was a little apprehensive myself. But when I walked in, all of these young boys were seated very primly and properly at their desk, and they all had their faces down to the desk. And I thought, how can I teach them if they won't look at me? So I had to go out to the principal's office and get the Afghan principal and tell him to come in and tell the boys that it was all right to look at me. You see, of course, these were Muslim boys, and they were taught that you don't look any woman, unless she's a member of your family. You do not look at her face. And I wasn't wearing a veil, nor did I ever have to wear a veil in Afghanistan. So they had to be told that it was all right. I was their teacher and they could look at me. And they all promptly lifted up their heads and, and took a look.
Which is interesting because there were no girls in your class.
No,
a very
none.
male-oriented society.
That's right.
You're imported into Kabul to teach English, which apparently they wanted to be taught.
Yes.
But you were a woman.
Yes.
Tell me when you were in Afghanistan and how did you get there?
I was in Afghanistan from 1956 to 58, and again in 1962 to 64 with my husband. And I got there because after graduating from Principia College, I went to Columbia to receive a master's degree in English. At that time, there were very few teaching positions in New York City. I ended up taking a position in the library office at Columbia. And while I was there, I met a woman whose husband was in charge of recruiting teachers for Afghanistan. Having dinner with him one Friday night, he turned to me and said, "Would you like to teach English in Afghanistan?" And I said, "Yes, I would love to." And that was the beginning of it all. When I was there in Kabul, there were no restaurants. At that time, there were no hotels. There were some rest houses, one of which I stayed in, and it was operated by a Swiss woman.
Which brings up the question, what did you do for entertainment? I mean, you were in your early 20s in a foreign country.
Well, yes, I was, and I was fortunate to meet individuals, staff members, from the other embassies. And the embassies would give parties, all the German, French, Italian. And at that time, too, some of the Marines who were stationed at the American embassy were very happy to escort you to any of these parties. And they were always in great demand because they were always very polite, very respectful young men, and they looked absolutely handsome in those blue uniforms. So most of the hostesses at the embassies were rather anxious to have them there. And I came along as part of the scene, I suppose. But the French embassy in particular was absolutely stunning. You would never know you were in Afghanistan. Crystal chandeliers, 3 or 4 of them in the ballroom, and red velvet curtains from floor to ceiling. It was absolutely, and pâte de foie gras and free-flowing champagne. It was kind of fun. So yes, we did manage to have some good times.
The French embassy was the most opulent one in
Yes.
Kabul?
Oh, yes.
How many embassies were there?
I couldn't really tell you. All of the major powers were there because this was at the end of the era of the Great Game and the British Raj. And there was quite not exactly the beginning of the Cold War with Russia, but we were vying with the major powers to establish a foothold in Afghanistan, and that's why we were there. My life in Afghanistan was so rich from the standpoint of learning another culture, another people, another religion. We lived next door to a mosque, by the way. The Kabul River flowed through Kabul, but there were women who would be down on the riverside washing their clothes. And then for a little further down, there might be somebody washing his donkey. And a little further than that, there might be somebody washing his face. I mean, it was their only source of water.
Could you tell that your students came from a ruling class, an elite class, whether the general population? Was it a lottery?
That's a very good question. I would say about 80% of my students were from the villages, and these were very poor students. And the reason that they were very good students was simply that they knew that English was their ticket to a better life, not only for themselves, but for their families.
Were you safe?
I was. That is I've often thought about this, the interesting part of it. I was never at any time in any kind of danger. The only time that I could say I was in a little bit of danger was going to the choi hanas, the tea houses, with my students after school. We went into some of the back bazaars. I would never venture back there by myself.
Bazaars?
That's right. That's the way they pronounce it, bazaars.
In
The Americans, I know.
Okay.
These shops were just hidden from the main road. If you ever got lost, I think it's a little bit like a souk in Morocco. If you ever got lost there, why, I don't know that you'd find your way out. At any rate, I had to have my students, a couple of them would go in front of me, a couple behind, and some on either side of me. Because as we would pass by these shops, some of the shopkeepers would hiss or spit at me. Because in their eyes, I was an immoral woman. And what were these young Afghan boys doing with me, etc. So they had to go ahead and in Farsi, tell the shopkeepers, it's all right, she's our teacher, she's come to teach us English, etc., etc. But we would go to the choi hanas and have tea, and they were very anxious to do this because they could practice their English. And they wanted to learn English very badly.
I want to go to the U.S. Marines. They were not there just for decorative purposes.
No.
They were there to protect the embassy and I presume all the Americans. But how much did you feel that presence? Was it sort of, how do I put it?
Casual.
Casual? Was it formal? Was their presence always felt by you? Did all the other people in Kabul realize that you had them to deal with if you weren't treated right? There is that sense when you're living in a foreign country that the military of your country will look after you.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the case when I was in Kabul both times. These were young men, quite, some of them still in their teens or early 20s, but they were committed to preserving the integrity and the peace of the American embassy, and they were willing to do it at a cost of their own lives. I've never seen such dedication. I have a tremendous respect for the Marines and all that they stand for. Even the
This is an odd question, but I'm curious because it clearly was an impressionable time of your life. Given all things being equal, namely ignoring the last 40 years of history in that country, and you were asked to go back there to teach English again, would you?
Yes, absolutely. But on one stipulation, that it would be women that I would teach.
I very much enjoyed having our conversation about your experience in Afghanistan. I've been speaking with Sylvia Hill, who taught there English in 1956 to 1958, and again for 2 or 3 years in the early 60s. Thank you for being here.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
So
It's so
interesting.
interesting.
It's interesting.